At 29, I was given a collapsing 1952 lake cottage on Birch Shore, while my sister received a brand new waterfront townhouse in Traverse City. That should have been the unfair part. It wasn't. The unfair part came 18 months later, after I rebuilt that cottage with my own savings, my own hands, and more sleepless winter nights than I can count. That's when my mother called and told me I had 17 hours to leave. The property legally in my name. The place I restored. The place she suddenly said my sister needed more. She gave me until noon the next day. Like I was checking out of a rental. Not standing in a kitchen, I rewired myself at 2 in the morning. And if you think that was the worst part, you haven't heard what happened when they showed up. At 29, I was given a collapsing 1952 lake cottage on Birch Shore, while my sister received a brand new waterfront townhouse in Traverse City. That should have been the unfair part. It wasn't. The unfair part came 18 months later, after I rebuilt that cottage with my own savings, my own hands, and more sleepless winter nights than I can count. That's when my mother called and told me I had 17 hours to leave. The property legally in my name. The place I restored. The place she suddenly said my sister needed more. She gave me until noon the next day, like I was checking out of a rental. Not standing in a kitchen, I rewired myself at 2 in the morning. But to understand how someone thinks they can take your home back, you have to understand what they handed you in the first place. My name is Eliza Monroe. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a regional supply coordinator for a medical distribution company in Traverse City, Michigan. I make $46,800 a year before taxes. I drive a 2013 Subaru Outback with 178,000 miles and a heater that works only when it feels generous. Until 2 years ago, I believed my mother loved both her daughters equally. I was wrong. My father, Daniel Monroe, built docks along Lake Michigan for most of his life. He had wide hands and a quiet voice, and a way of looking at a structure like he could see the future of it. The warping, the cracks, the weak beams that needed reinforcement before they failed. I grew up holding flashlights and learning that if something sagged, you didn't ignore it. You braced it. You fixed it. He died of a heart attack at 53. No warning. One morning making coffee. Gone by the afternoon. He left no will. He assumed he had time. Under Michigan law, everything transferred to my mother, Sharon Monroe. My sister Camille is 3 years older than I am. She works in brand partnerships for a hospitality group downtown. She knows how to stage a room, how to frame a sunset, how to make a life look polished from the outside. She also knows how to lean in when things feel uncertain. She calls Mom daily. Mom handles her paperwork, her insurance renewals, her lease questions. Camille calls that closeness. I call it dependency. I've always handled things on my own. Taxes, repairs, flat tires. Mom interpreted that as distance, as if independence meant I didn't need her. 2 years ago, Mom sold our childhood home in Sutton's Bay. She told us she received $318,000 for it. She said most of it would go toward setting the girls up properly. I didn't question it. I trusted her. On my 29th birthday, she invited us to dinner. Camille received keys. A brand new 3-bedroom townhouse overlooking West Grand Traverse Bay. White cabinetry, glass balcony, heated garage. Purchase price, $412,000. Camille cried. Mom cried. There were photos. Champagne. I received a manila envelope. Inside was a deed transfer for a lake cottage on Birch Shore Road, about 25 minutes north of town. My father had inherited it from a distant cousin years ago. It had been sitting vacant ever since. The county assessed it at $94,000. The roof sagged near the chimney. The east-facing windows leaked. Half the wiring still ran through brittle cloth insulation. The place smelled like damp wood and something that had once been alive. Mom smiled across the table. Camille needs stability, she said softly. You've always been resourceful, Eliza. You'll make something of it. Translation: I gave the polished future to the daughter I worry about. You can manage the burden. Camille glanced at the paperwork and laughed lightly. At least you won't have rent. Everyone at the table smiled. I didn't. I signed the deed transfer that night. Voluntary. Notarized. Recorded. My name alone. The next morning, I drove out to Birch Shore. The lake was steel gray. The wind cut sharp across the shoreline. The cottage leaned slightly toward the water as if it had been listening for something that never returned. When I opened the door, it groaned. Cold air rushed through the gaps in the window frames. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots. Somewhere above me, something shifted in the rafters. It was ugly. It was broken. It was mine. I had $18,200 in savings. No backup plan. No partner. No inheritance beyond what I could salvage from rotting beams and outdated wiring. That first night, I slept in a sleeping bag in the living room because the bedroom ceiling showed water stains shaped like maps. The furnace coughed twice and stopped. My breath fogged in the air. Around midnight, I heard scratching in the attic. I climbed the ladder with a flashlight and met the steady, unbothered stare of a raccoon who clearly believed I was the intruder. I named him Harbor, because if I was going to rebuild this place, I might as well start by naming what was living in it. The next morning, I drove to work like nothing had changed. But everything had. Because somewhere between signing that deed and standing alone in that freezing living room, I made a decision. If they believed they'd handed me a liability, they were about to learn what I could build from it. Part 2. What it takes to stay. Hidden CTA included naturally. The first thing I learned about the cottage on Birch Shore was that nothing worked the way it was supposed to. The furnace didn't need servicing. It was finished. Dead beyond negotiation. The technician who came out took one look at the unit, checked the serial plate, and gave me that careful expression people use when they don't want to sound insulting. Ma'am, this system is older than I am. Replacement estimate, $9,200. That was half my savings. I signed anyway. Because heat in northern Michigan isn't optional, it's survival. I stopped thinking of money as comfort. It became material, lumber, wiring, insulation, nails. Every dollar needed to turn into something physical that kept the structure standing. I created a spreadsheet that night. I called it structure. Every expense went into it. Every receipt scanned. Every supply tracked. If I couldn't afford contractors, I would become one. I worked my regular job from 7:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., then drove straight to Birch Shore. I ate dinners out of a cooler. I watched tutorials on drywall repair and electrical safety while sitting in my car because the Wi-Fi inside the cottage didn't exist yet. Week 3, I tore up the warped linoleum in the kitchen. Underneath it, I found original maple flooring. Scratched, dust-covered, forgotten under decades of neglect. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have. That was the first moment I realized the place wasn't ruined. It was buried. I rented a floor sander and spent 3 weekends restoring those boards. My shoulders burned so badly I had to sleep with my arms folded across my chest just to keep them still. When I brushed the first finish coat on, the wood glowed warm gold in the late afternoon light. It was the first time the cottage felt like it was answering back. Harbor the raccoon continued to live in the attic during this period. We developed an understanding. I repaired below. He stomped above like an irritated landlord. Eventually, I sealed the roofline vents and installed new screening. He relocated without ceremony. Camille visited once during month 4. She wore suede boots, on a construction floor. She stepped around exposed wiring and took photos for a family chat. Eliza's wilderness era, she captioned. Mom replied with a heart emoji. No one asked how much the repairs were costing. Meanwhile, Camille's townhouse was professionally decorated. Mom helped her pick furniture, covered part of the closing costs, called it an investment in stability. I replaced a shattered window myself using a video paused at the exact moment someone explained glazing compound. But something unexpected happened in those long, quiet evenings. I started to feel capable in a way I never had before. Not successful, not admired, just capable. There's a difference. By month 8, the roof no longer leaked. The electrical panel was updated. I installed insulation thick enough to keep out lake winds that used to whistle through the walls. Total spending had reached $51,600. I took out a small personal loan to keep going. No one knew. I didn't tell Mom. I didn't tell Camille. Some journeys don't need commentary. They just need continuation. And if you've ever built something quietly while the rest of the world assumed you wouldn't finish, you understand that kind of focus better than anyone else. By month 14, neighbors began slowing their cars when they passed. The cottage stood straighter. The siding had been replaced. The porch stabilized. It looked less like abandonment, more like intention. 18 months after I first unlocked that door, the county sent a reassessment notice. New value, $436,000. I read the number twice. Then I sat down on the front steps I had rebuilt and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for a year and a half. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and proud and completely certain of one thing. No one else had built this. 3 days later, my phone rang. Mom. Her voice was calm. Too calm. How much is the property worth now? She asked. And just like that, the air shifted. When my mother asked how much the property was worth, she didn't sound curious. She sounded prepared. That was the first thing that unsettled me. About 436, I answered, leaning against the kitchen counter I had installed myself. That's the county number. Market might be higher. There was a pause on the line. Not surprise, not pride, just silence long enough to feel deliberate. That's good, she said finally. You've done well. It was the kind of compliment that didn't actually belong to me. We hung up a minute later. I stood there for a while, staring at the grain of the wood countertop, trying to figure out why the conversation felt wrong. 3 days later, my cousin Nora called. Nora doesn't call unless something matters. She lives downstate in Grand Rapids, works as a veterinary tech, and avoids family drama with the precision of someone who's seen enough of it already. Eliza, she said carefully, I think you should know something. There had been a family gathering over the weekend. I hadn't been invited. That detail alone told me who organized it. Nora said she'd gone into the kitchen to grab ice when she overheard Mom and Camille talking in the hallway. They didn't know she was there. Mom had said, word for word, I gave Eliza that place because I thought she'd sell it back cheap. I didn't think she'd actually fix it. That property was always meant for Camille. I need to correct this. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't understand. Because I understood perfectly. Clarity doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in like cold air. Thank you for telling me, I said. I just thought you deserved to know, Nora replied. I ended the call and sat down at the table. Every decision from the past 2 years rearranged itself in my mind. The difference in the gifts. The financial help Camille received. The questions Mom asked only after the reassessment. It hadn't been generosity. It had been a calculation. And now that the calculation had failed, she was trying to rewrite it. The next morning, before work, I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney in Traverse City. Her office overlooked the marina. Clean lines, organized shelves, the kind of space where nothing was left ambiguous. Her name was Rebecca Harlan. She reviewed the deed transfer, adjusting her glasses slightly as she read. This is a voluntary conveyance, she said. Signed, notarized, recorded with the county. You are the sole legal owner. So she can't undo it? Rebecca shook her head. Not without proving fraud or coercion. And that's a very high bar. Relief came slowly, like muscles unclenching one at a time. But, Rebecca added, in situations like this, legal standing isn't always what people rely on. They rely on pressure. If you anticipate conflict, document everything. Everything. I went home that evening and created a folder on my laptop. I named it Foundation. Inside I saved the recorded deed, all renovation receipts, loan documents, inspection reports, photographs from every stage of the rebuild. 287 files, 18 months of proof. Then I did something else. I looked up the public record for the sale of our childhood home in Sutton's Bay, the one Mom said sold for $318,000. Recorded sale price, $372,000. I stared at the number, $54,000 unaccounted for. Enough to explain how Camille's townhouse had been financed so easily. Enough to explain why Mom expected me to fail quietly. I took a screenshot, saved it to Foundation, closed the laptop. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Information is leverage, but only if you know when to use it. Over the next few weeks, Mom's calls became less casual. More probing. Questions about insurance, taxes, whether I planned to stay there long term. Each one sounded harmless. Together, they sounded like preparation. Camille, meanwhile, began mentioning rising maintenance costs at the townhouse, HOA fees increasing, repairs needed to shared roofing. She spoke about them like inconveniences. I listened. I said very little, because I was beginning to understand something important. This wasn't about fairness. It was about repositioning assets. And somewhere behind those polite phone calls, a decision had already been made. I just hadn't been told yet. But I would be, soon. And this time, I wouldn't be surprised. The call came on a Tuesday evening. I remember the exact time because I had just finished sealing the last section of the porch railing. The sun was dropping behind the lake, turning the water that dull silver blue it gets right before dusk. The air smelled like cedar and cold iron. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Mom. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. I answered. She didn't say hello. We need to talk about the cottage. Not how are you. Not, I saw the photos. It looks beautiful. Just business. I stayed quiet. She continued, her tone measured. Calm in that way that meant she had already decided how this conversation would go. Camille is having some difficulty with the townhouse. The expenses are higher than expected. The market isn't as stable as we thought. It makes more sense for her to be somewhere less complicated. Less complicated. I looked around at the structure I had rebuilt board by board. Okay, I said slowly. And we've decided it would be best if you two exchanged properties. There it was. Simple. Direct. Delivered like a logistics plan instead of a demand. You can move into the townhouse, she added. Camille will take the cottage. It keeps everything balanced. Balanced. I let the word hang there. I'm not moving, I said. A pause. Not confusion. Resistance. Eliza, she replied, voice tightening. This isn't emotional. It's practical. Camille needs a stable situation right now. You've already proven you can handle change. Handle change. Meaning, sacrifice again. I rebuilt this place, I said. It's not a temporary project. It's my home. We gave you that property, she snapped. No, I corrected quietly. You transferred it, legally. Another silence. This one sharper. You're being difficult, she said. We're trying to do what's best for the family. I stepped down from the porch and onto the gravel, needing to move, needing the grounding sound under my boots. What's best for the family, I said, or what's easiest to rearrange? She ignored that. We're coming tomorrow at noon to talk this through, she said. Then, as if she realized talking might not produce the result she wanted, she added, you should be ready to make the transition. I understood what that meant. Not a conversation, an assumption, a plan already in motion. Mom, I said, steady now. You can come if you want, but nothing is changing. Her patience snapped. You have always been stubborn, she said. I thought you'd understand loyalty, and I thought you'd understand ownership, I replied. That was when she said it. You have 17 hours to think about this before we arrive. 17 hours. The same amount of time you might give a tenant. Not a daughter. She hung up. I stood there listening to the wind come off the lake. 17 hours. It was supposed to sound like pressure. Instead, it felt like confirmation. Everything Nora overheard. Everything Rebecca warned me about. Everything I suspected when I saw that reassessment notice. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attempt to reverse a decision that hadn't gone the way she planned. I walked back inside and opened my laptop. Foundation. Every document was there, organized and dated. Proof of ownership. Proof of investment. Proof of intent. I added one more folder. Communication. Saved the call log. Wrote down exactly what she'd said while it was still fresh. Then I emailed Rebecca. Subject line, we may have a situation. She replied within 20 minutes. Do not engage further. If they arrive, contact me immediately. Professional, direct, prepared. I slept that night, surprisingly. Not well, but not anxiously either, because something had shifted. The first 18 months here had been about rebuilding wood, wiring, structure. Now it was about holding ground. And those are two very different kinds of work. At 6:30 the next morning, I walked out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the lake. The cottage stood solid behind me. No sagging roof, no drafts, no uncertainty about whether it would survive the winter. I had already done the hardest part. No one was taking this place from me. Not with guilt, not with pressure, not with 17 hours. If they were coming at noon, they were about to learn exactly how permanent a signed deed can be. By 11:40 the next morning, the lake had gone completely still. That kind of stillness always comes before weather changes. My father used to say you could tell when pressure was shifting because even the gulls stopped arguing. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee long gone cold, watching the narrow stretch of Birch Shore Road that led to the cottage. Rebecca had already emailed me a formal notice to use if necessary. Calm, precise language stating ownership, legal transfer, and trespass implications if entry was forced. It sat printed on the table beside me. I hoped I wouldn't need it. At 11:57, a black SUV turned onto the gravel drive. Mom drove. Camille sat in the passenger seat. No moving truck, no boxes, just assumption. They stepped out like they were arriving for a visit. Mom didn't knock. She opened the door halfway before I reached it, as if muscle memory still told her she belonged here. Eliza, she said, stepping inside, we need to resolve this. Camille lingered behind her, eyes scanning the room. She hadn't seen the finished interior yet. Most people's first reaction to the restored maple floors, the exposed beams, the wide view of the water was quiet appreciation. Camille's reaction was calculation. This looks different, she said. It's finished, I replied. Mom set her purse down on the counter like she was settling in. We don't want this to become a conflict, she began. It already was. I spoke with an attorney, I said, sliding the printed document toward her. This property is legally mine. That isn't negotiable. She didn't pick up the paper. Eliza, we're not talking about legality. We're talking about family cooperation. There's no difference when property is involved, I said. Camille crossed her arms. You could at least consider how hard things are for me right now. I met her eyes. I do, I said. But that doesn't mean giving up my home. The word home seemed to land harder than anything else. Mom finally glanced at the document, though she didn't read it fully. You're choosing this place over your sister. No, I answered. I'm choosing not to undo 18 months of work. Silence. The kind that forces reality into the room whether anyone likes it or not. Camille looked out the window toward the shoreline. You really did all of this yourself? She asked. Yes. Another pause. Mom shifted strategies. You've always been independent, she said, voice softening. We thought this would be temporary for you. That was the first honest sentence she'd spoken. Temporary. They had expected me to fail or move on. I stayed, I said simply. Mom looked around again, not evaluating, seeing. The reinforced beams, the new wiring, the insulation work. The proof that the gamble she'd made hadn't worked out the way she imagined. No one raised their voice. No one issued another ultimatum. There was nothing left to threaten. Because pressure only works when the other person believes they can't stand without you. And I already had. If you've ever had to build stability before anyone else believed you could, you know that moment. The quiet one where the argument ends not because someone wins, but because the facts don't move. Camille exhaled slowly. I didn't know, she admitted. Mom didn't respond. She picked up her purse again. We'll talk later, she said, though it sounded less like a plan and more like retreat. They left the way they came. No resolution speech, no dramatic exit, just gravel shifting under tires as they drove away. I stood in the doorway long after the sound faded. The cottage didn't feel contested anymore. It felt settled. Not because they agreed, because they couldn't change it. That afternoon, I emailed Rebecca a brief update. Her response came back minutes later. Then it appears the matter is closed. Closed. I walked down to the shoreline and let the cold water run over my hands. For 2 years, this place had been a project. Then it became a defense. Now, finally, it was just mine. And for the first time since signing that deed, I allowed myself to stop bracing for the next conversation. Sometimes the strongest boundary isn't loud. It's simply staying where you are, and not moving when someone expects you to. The week after my mother and Camille left Birch Shore, nothing happened. No calls, no follow-up messages, no attempts to revisit the conversation. At first, the silence felt suspicious, like the pause after a storm when you're not sure if another front is forming over the lake. I found myself checking my phone more often than I needed to, half expecting another demand, another carefully worded appeal to obligation. But the phone stayed quiet. Life, inconveniently normal, continued. I went to work, reviewed inventory schedules, answered emails about delayed shipments and back orders, drank coffee from the same chipped mug I'd been using since college. No one at the office knew that 18 months of my life had nearly been negotiated away over a kitchen counter. That's the strange thing about personal upheaval. The rest of the world keeps running on schedule. Evenings, I returned to the cottage and worked on smaller things. Not repairs anymore. Improvements, built-in shelving, repainting the guest room, planting hardy shrubs along the driveway so the wind wouldn't carve snowdrifts across it next winter. The work felt different now. Not urgent, intentional. One afternoon, while reorganizing receipts I no longer needed to justify, I realized I hadn't opened the structure spreadsheet in days. For 2 years, that file had been survival. Now it was history. Camille called the following Sunday. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. "Hey," she said. No defensiveness, no tension, just tentative. "Hey." A pause. "I didn't understand what you were doing out there," she admitted. "I thought it was just a phase." I leaned against the doorframe, looking out toward the lake. "It wasn't. I see that now." Another pause, longer this time. "The townhouse has been harder than I expected," she said. "Costs, repairs, everything. Mom handled most of that before. I didn't realize how much. There it was. Not blame, recognition. "You'll figure it out," I said. "I guess I have to." We didn't solve anything in that conversation, but we didn't argue either. It ended with a simple, "Talk later," and that was enough. Mom didn't call. Not that week. Not the next. When she finally did, it wasn't about property. It was about the weather. "I heard you're getting early frost up there," she said. We talked for 7 minutes about tomato plants and lake effect wind patterns. Not once did she mention ownership, fairness, or moving. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recalibration. The dynamic that had existed for years, her directing, me accommodating, had quietly dissolved. Neither of us knew exactly what replaced it yet. But the old structure was gone. Daniel would have called that a necessary tear out. You can't reinforce a frame without removing what doesn't hold weight anymore. I spent that evening installing the last of the shelves in the study nook I'd carved out of what used to be a storage room. Books went up slowly, manuals, old novels, a weathered notebook of my father's I'd found packed away years ago. Inside, he'd written measurements, sketches, reminders. One line caught my eye. "Build it like you'll have to stand on it alone someday." I sat there longer than I meant to, because that's exactly what this place had become. Not a test, not a compromise, a structure I could stand on without asking permission. If you've ever reached that point, where something you fought to keep finally stops feeling like a fight, you know the shift. It's subtle, almost easy to miss, but it changes how you move forward from that day on. By early spring, the cottage no longer felt like a project I defended. It felt like a life I'd chosen, and no one, not even family, was rearranging it again. By the time the snow began to melt along Birch Shore, the cottage had settled into itself. Winter had tested everything. The new insulation held. The pipes didn't freeze. The roof I'd reinforced carried the weight of lake effect snow without a single complaint. When the thaw came, There were no leaks, no warped boards, no surprises waiting beneath the surface. For the first time since I'd taken ownership, the place wasn't reacting to damage. It was simply standing. That kind of stability is quieter than people expect. There's no moment of celebration, no clear finish line, just an absence of problems that used to be constant. At work, I found myself less exhausted. Not because my schedule had changed, but because I wasn't dividing energy between survival and repair anymore. I could focus on one thing at a time. Camille visited in early April. She called ahead this time. No assumptions. No arriving unannounced. "Is it okay if I stop by?" she asked. "Yes," I said. When she pulled into the drive, she stood outside for a moment before coming up to the porch. I watched her take in the siding, the rebuilt railing, the cleared path down to the shoreline. "It looks different than I remember," she said. "It is." Inside, she walked slowly through the rooms, not evaluating, observing, running her hand lightly over the edge of the kitchen counter, like she was trying to understand how much time had gone into making it smooth. "You really did all this yourself?" she said again. "Yes." There was no defensiveness in her voice this time, just acknowledgement. We sat at the table facing the lake. The same table where months earlier our mother had tried to convince me to give this place up. Camille folded her hands. "I think Mom believed she was protecting me," she said. "Maybe," I answered. I didn't see how much she was managing until I had to manage it myself. That was the first honest assessment either of us had spoken aloud. Independence isn't something you can gift someone. You have to learn it by needing it. Camille talked about the townhouse, the repairs she'd handled alone, the budgeting she'd started doing, the realization that convenience often hides responsibility. "I used to think you just liked doing things the hard way," she admitted with a small smile. "I didn't choose hard," I said. "I chose permanent." She nodded. That seemed to make sense to her now. We didn't talk about Mom directly after that. Not because we were avoiding her, but because she was no longer the center of the situation. The shift had already happened. Before Camille left, she stood on the porch and looked out over the water. "I get it now," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. Some realizations don't need explanation. Mom called later that week. Her tone had changed too. Less directive, less certain. She asked about the repairs holding through winter, about whether I needed anything for spring maintenance. It was practical, neutral, almost careful. We spoke for 10 minutes. Nothing heavy, nothing unresolved. Just conversation that didn't try to steer. When the call ended, I realized something unexpected. The conflict hadn't ended with an argument. It had ended with adjustment. Everyone learning new footing at different speeds. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the property, checking the posts along the shoreline where ice sometimes shifted them. The ground was soft underfoot. The lake, calm again. 18 months of rebuilding had changed more than the cottage. It had changed the expectations tied to it. No one saw it as temporary anymore, least of all me. There's a difference between proving something and simply living inside what you've built. One is exhausting. The other is steady. And steady, I was learning, is what lasts. Part 8. A different kind of work. Spring came slowly to Birch Shore. The ice receded first, leaving behind a jagged edge of dark water that widened a little more each morning. The wind lost its bite. The ground softened. By late April, small shoots of green began pushing through soil that had spent months locked beneath frost. For the first time since I had taken ownership of the cottage, the work I was doing wasn't repair. It was maintenance. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I fixed a loose dock plank my father had installed years earlier, repainted the boathouse door, replaced a section of railing simply because I wanted it to match the rest. None of it felt urgent. None of it felt like something collapsing. It felt like care. Camille started visiting every few weeks. Not out of obligation, but because she wanted to learn things she had never needed to know before. How to check water pressure, how to reseal exterior trim, how to recognize when something small might become something expensive if ignored. One Saturday, she showed up in work gloves instead of city shoes. That's new, I said. I figured I should probably stop ruining footwear, she answered. We spent the afternoon rebuilding a set of steps that led down toward the shoreline. The work was straightforward: measure, cut, secure. But it took patience. Camille asked questions at every stage, not because she doubted, because she wanted to understand. I always thought you just knew how to do this, she said at one point. I didn't, I replied. I learned because I had to. She nodded, tightening a bolt with more care than necessary. That's how independence begins, not with confidence, but with responsibility. Our conversations became easier after that. Less about what had happened, more about what we were doing now. Camille talked about restructuring her budget, taking on projects in the townhouse herself instead of outsourcing everything. She sounded tired sometimes, but she also sounded proud. Mom remained more distant, though not absent. She called occasionally, usually about ordinary things: groceries, weather, a neighbor she'd run into. She never mentioned the property again, not once. I understood that silence now. It wasn't avoidance. It was acceptance she didn't quite know how to phrase. One evening, she surprised me by stopping by alone. No announcement, no agenda. She stood at the edge of the driveway looking at the cottage like she was seeing it for the first time. Not as a transaction, not as an arrangement, but as a finished place. You've made it solid, she said. That was the goal. She didn't come inside, didn't inspect, didn't comment further. After a few minutes, she simply said she'd wanted to see it in person and left. It wasn't emotional, but it was real. Later that night, I sat on the porch listening to the water move against the rocks. The sounds of the lake had changed with the season, less violent, more rhythmic. I realized something I hadn't noticed before. For months, every improvement I'd made had been about proving the structure could survive. Now, the work was about making it comfortable to stay. That shift, from survival to sustainability, is easy to miss. But it's where a place stops being a project and becomes part of your life. Camille texted me the next morning. Thanks for yesterday. I think I finally understand why you stayed. I read that message twice. Understanding had taken time, but it had arrived. And once it did, there was nothing left to argue about. The cottage didn't represent imbalance anymore. It represented effort. And effort, unlike gifts, can't be reassigned. By early May, the last of the seasonal repairs were done. The dock was back in the water. The windows opened to let in air that no longer carried winter's edge. For the first time since signing that deed, I wasn't bracing for change. I was just living here, and that, more than any renovation, was what made the place finally feel finished. By early summer, Birch Shore had settled into a rhythm I no longer questioned. Mornings began with light coming across the water instead of through a windshield during a commute. I still drove into Traverse City for work, still handled logistics schedules and supply reports, but the return each evening felt different. The cottage wasn't waiting to be fixed anymore. It was waiting to be lived in. The garden beds I built along the side of the house finally took hold. Tomatoes climbed higher than expected. Basil spread faster than I could use it. Small signs of permanence, the kind that don't show up in reassessment values or renovation spreadsheets. Camille visited more often. Not every week, but enough that her presence felt natural rather than occasional. Sometimes she brought tools, sometimes groceries. Once she brought a stack of old photos she'd found while reorganizing Mom's attic. We sat at the kitchen table flipping through them. There was one of our father standing on this very shoreline years before the cottage had fallen into disrepair. Measuring something, pencil tucked behind his ear. Another of us as kids, barefoot on the dock. I don't remember this place looking so worn, Camille said. It wasn't, I answered. Time just kept moving after we stopped coming. She studied the rebuilt beams overhead. You didn't just repair it, she said quietly. You gave it back its purpose. I hadn't thought about it that way before. But she was right. Restoration isn't about making something new. It's about making it usable again. Mom came for dinner later that month. The first time she'd stayed longer than a few minutes since everything happened. She brought a salad. Asked where I kept serving bowls instead of assuming. Small changes, but noticeable ones. We ate outside on the porch. The conversation stayed ordinary: traffic in town, a local store closing, Camille's ongoing repairs at the townhouse. No one mentioned the argument that had once defined this place. At one point, Mom looked out over the water and said, almost to herself, "Your father always liked this view." I nodded. "He built things to last," I replied. She didn't answer right away. But she didn't disagree either. That was enough. Not resolution, recognition. After dinner, Camille helped wash dishes while Mom walked down toward the dock. Watching her from the window, I realized she wasn't inspecting anything. She was remembering. People adjust in their own ways, some with apologies, some with distance, some with quiet acceptance that the structure they expected to control no longer belongs to them. Later that evening, after they left, I stepped outside again. The lake was calm, reflecting the last light of the day in long, even streaks. 2 years ago, this place had felt like an assignment I hadn't asked for. Then it became a responsibility I couldn't abandon. Now it was simply where I lived. That evolution had nothing to do with property values or fairness or who received what. It had to do with time invested. With staying when leaving would have been easier. There's a point in any long effort where the narrative around it fades. You stop explaining it to others. Stop justifying it to yourself. You just maintain it. I walked the length of the dock, checking the boards automatically the way my father used to. Not because they were failing, but because that's what you do when something matters. You pay attention. And when something is built with attention, it tends to stay standing. The cottage no longer felt like something contested or reclaimed. It felt like something continuous. And continuity, I realized, was the one thing no one could redistribute. By the second autumn at Birch Shore, the cottage had fully become what it was always meant to be. Not a project, not a symbol, just a home. The wind returned the way it always does along Lake Michigan, sharp, persistent, carrying that familiar scent of water and iron. Leaves gathered along the rebuilt porch steps, the same steps that 2 years earlier had been soft with rot and ready to collapse under weight. Now they held steady. So did everything else. My routine had settled into something predictable. Work during the day. Evenings spent cooking, reading, or handling the kind of small upkeep that comes with any place you plan to keep long-term. There was no rush anymore, no long list of urgent repairs waiting to be tackled before winter. Only maintenance. Camille had adjusted too. Her townhouse wasn't effortless, but she handled it herself now. Learned to schedule repairs, question estimates, and keep track of costs instead of letting someone else quietly manage them. When she visited, we talked less about what had happened and more about what we were building separately. Different lives. Equal footing. Mom never tried to revisit the conversation about exchanging properties again. Not once. Instead, she called occasionally to ask about practical things, whether the shoreline needed reinforcing after storms, whether the insulation held during temperature drops. Questions that acknowledged the reality she once resisted. This place wasn't temporary. It wasn't negotiable. It was mine. One evening in late October, she came by with a box of old tools she'd found in storage. My father's measuring tape, a worn level, a set of chisels dulled from years of use. "I thought you should have these," she said. No explanation, no apology, just recognition of where they belonged now. I took them, not as compensation, as continuation. After she left, I set the tools on the workbench in the small shed behind the cottage. The same shed I had repaired piece by piece that first winter. Running my hand over the surface of the wood, I realized something I hadn't been able to articulate before. The real conflict had never been about who deserved what. It had been about expectation. They expected me to treat this place like an inconvenience. I chose to treat it like a foundation. And foundations, once built properly, don't move. That's the strange part of effort. At the time, it feels isolating, like you're the only one carrying the weight. But later, when everything settles, you realize that effort becomes structure, something you stand on without thinking about how it got there. Some of you listening to this might understand that feeling better than others. The quiet work, the long hours no one notices, the decisions that don't look dramatic from the outside, but change everything over time. Those are the parts that last. On the anniversary of the day I signed the deed, I walked down to the shoreline before sunset. The lake was calm, reflecting a sky already shifting toward winter gray. I could hear the house behind me, the subtle creak of boards adjusting to temperature, the steady hum of systems that now worked exactly as they should. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing threatened collapse. That's when you know you've finished the hardest part. Not when the work ends. When the worry does. I stayed there a while, thinking about how close I had come to seeing this place as something temporary, something negotiable, something I could give up to keep peace. Instead, it became proof that staying, quietly, consistently, can change the entire outcome of a story. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. What you build with your own hands can't be reassigned by someone else's expectations. It can only be maintained, protected, lived in. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been handed something underestimated and turned it into something permanent, then you already understand why staying mattered more than winning. And there are more stories like this ahead, the kind that don't look dramatic at first but stay with you longer than you expect.